July 30th, 2001. A debut album drops in Australia. Not America, not Britain, but Australia. Inside record stores across Sydney and Melbourne sits a CD with a controversial cover. A black-gloved hand resting on bare skin. The band behind it? 5 20-something kids from New York who'd been playing to crowds of 50 people just 18 months earlier. The album is called Is This It? No question mark, because it wasn't a question. Within 8 weeks, the record would hit number 2 in the UK charts. Critics would call it the savior of rock and roll. A 15-year-old kid named Alex Turner in Sheffield would hear it and decide to start a band. The music industry, drowning in nu metal and manufactured pop, would suddenly remember what guitars were supposed to sound like. But here's what nobody tells you. The label didn't want this album. They tried to stop it. They brought in a famous producer to fix it. When that didn't work, they recorded it anyway in a basement studio that was being foreclosed. The album was supposed to drop on September 25th, 2001. Then the Twin Towers fell and everything changed. This is the story of 5 kids who accidentally saved rock music and then walked away. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. This is The Strokes. To understand Is This It? You have to understand something about New York City in 1998. The city that had given the world the Ramones, Television, Blondie, and Talking Heads was musically irrelevant. Hip-hop had moved west. Grunge had died with Kurt Cobain. The Lower East Side clubs that once launched movements now booked cover bands and DJ nights. Into this vacuum walked 5 kids who had no business being in a band together. Julian Casablancas was the son of John Casablancas, founder of Elite Model Management, one of the most powerful men in the fashion industry. He'd been sent to boarding school in Switzerland at age 13, where he met Albert Hammond Jr., son of the songwriter behind It Never Rains in Southern California. When Julian returned to New York, he attended Dwight School in Manhattan with Nick Valenci and Fabrizio Moretti, sons of privilege studying at a private school where tuition rivaled college costs. The 5th member, Nicolas Freiture, had known Casablanca since they were 6 years old at Lycée Français. These weren't hungry street kids fighting their way out of poverty. These were prep school graduates who could have followed their fathers into business or finance. Instead, they wanted to play in a band. The earliest incarnation of the Strokes formed in 1998. Casablancas was the frontman by default. He wrote the songs, even though he later admitted he didn't consider himself a natural singer. Hammond Jr. had been living across the street from his father's modeling agency when Casablancas reconnected with him. The addition of Hammond Jr. completed the lineup. They started rehearsing in a space on the Lower East Side, working through Casablanca's songs. The music was simple, direct. None of them were virtuoso musicians, and they knew it. They embraced limitations as style. Their first official show happened in 1998 at a club called Spiral. 5 people showed up, all friends. For the next year and a half, the Strokes played to nearly empty rooms across Manhattan. They secured a weekly residency at a dive bar, grinding through sets while bartenders counted receipts and ignored them. Nobody cared. The New York music scene had moved on to electronica and hip-hop. Guitar bands were seen as passé, nostalgic, irrelevant. But there was one person paying attention. Gordon Raphael was nobody. A 40-year-old producer-engineer who'd spent 2 decades making weird industrial music and bouncing between Seattle and New York, never quite catching a break. By the late 90s, he was living in a basement on the Lower East Side, running a tiny studio called Transporter Ram, named after the German word for cargo hold or the Star Trek transporter beam. The studio was located at Avenue A, down a corridor piled with rusting radiators. You entered through a graffiti-smeared door, walked down to the basement, and found yourself in a dingy space lit by bare bulbs, furnished with a torn red velvet couch. The ceilings were low. The equipment was modest. A Soundcraft Ghost 32 input desk, some basic preamps, Pro Tools. Nothing fancy. Raphael had been hustling bands for months, going to clubs and handing out cards. One night in late 1999, he went to a small venue and saw 2 bands play to about 50 people. One was called Come On, the other was called The Strokes. I went up to both bands afterward, Raphael recalls, and said, I have a studio 2 blocks away. Let's make a cheap demo. Come On, the band Raphael actually preferred, never called back. 4 days later, Nick Valenci and Albert Hammond Jr. showed up at Transporter Ram to check out the studio. What happened next changed everything. Raphael made them an offer. 3 songs in 3 days, dirt cheap. The Strokes agreed. In December 1999, they recorded The Modern Age, Last Night, and Barely Legal. Live, fast, raw. Raphael's approach was unconventional. He'd spent years in the industrial music scene, learning to create textures and atmosphere with minimal equipment. He didn't have expensive microphones or pristine recording environments. What he had was an ear for capturing energy. I wanted to do a live recording, Raphael explained. Or at least as much live stuff as possible. I even wanted the vocals to be live at that time, so I set Julian up to sing alongside the band. The result was 3 songs that sounded like nothing else in 2000. Not polished, not perfect, but alive. But Casablancas described his vision for the band's sound as wanting them to be a band from the past that took a time trip into the future to make their record. It was retro without being nostalgic, forward-thinking without being pretentious. Those 3 songs became the Modern Age EP. Ryan Gentles was a 22-year-old booking agent at Mercury Lounge, a small venue on Houston Street. He'd been a musician himself, vocalist and guitarist in 2 failed bands. Now he was booking other people's shows and wondering if he'd ever make it in the music business. The Strokes kept asking him to manage them. 3 or 4 times, they asked. Gentles kept declining. They were unsigned, unknown, and he had no experience managing bands. But Gentles believed in the music. So he started sending out the Modern Age EP to anyone who might listen. 1 copy went across the Atlantic to Geoff Travis, founder of Rough Trade Records. Travis had launched The Smiths, defined British post-punk, and temporarily closed his label in the 90s. By 2000, he was looking for something to restart it with. Travis claims he listened to the Modern Age for about 10 seconds over a transatlantic phone line before deciding to sign the Strokes. What I heard was the songwriting skills of a first-rate writer, Travis remembers, and music that was a distillation of primal rock and roll mixed with the sophistication of today's society. I just felt it was the best record from a rock and roll band out of New York City that I'd heard since the CBGB's era. James Endicott, Rough Trade's A&R representative, was equally blown away. Geoff Travis played me the Modern Age one morning, and it was like hearing all your favorite records in one. It was exhilarating. In January 2001, Rough Trade released the Modern Age EP in the UK, exactly as Raphael had recorded it in his basement. No remixing, no overdubs, just 3 raw songs pressed onto vinyl. The British music press went insane. NME named it Single of the Week. The Strokes aren't just a sound perfectly preserved in retro aspect. They're the latest in a thrilling line of American bands reinvigorating rock with taut guitar lines, stunning dynamics, and great hair. Rough Trade flew the Strokes to London for their first European shows. The first gig, in Portsmouth supporting And You Will Know Us by the Trail of Dead, was terrible according to the band. But by the second night in Brighton, something had changed. There was a queue around the block. People were pushing to get in. Strokes fever had struck the UK. Meanwhile, back in America, record labels started circling. A bidding war erupted. In March 2001, the Strokes signed with RCA Records for a substantial deal. Now they had to make an album. RCA had big plans. They wanted the Strokes to work with Gil Norton, the legendary producer behind Pixies' Doolittle, Foo Fighters hits, and countless alternative rock classics. Norton was professional, experienced, capable of delivering radio-ready hits. The label flew the Strokes to a proper recording studio. State-of-the-art equipment, pristine acoustics, everything a band could want. They recorded 3 songs with Norton. Then, the Strokes listened back. It sounded too clean, the band later explained. Too pretentious. Casablancas hated it. The rough edges were gone. The energy was polished away. It sounded like every other alternative rock record. They scrapped all 3 songs. RCA was furious. They just spent significant money on a name producer, and the band was walking away. But Casablancas was adamant. He called Gordon Raphael. Julian came back to me, Raphael remembers. The Norton sessions hadn't worked out and he was depressed. I heard the demos. You could hear the professionalism and cleanliness. That wasn't what I'd done with them. Raphael was back on board. But there was a problem. His Transporter AM studio was facing foreclosure. He was about to be evicted. RCA reluctantly agreed to fund sessions at Transporter AM, but only if the band could finish quickly. They had 6 weeks. March to April 2001. The Strokes and Gordon Raphael locked themselves in that basement on Avenue A and made history. The sessions for Is This It? Were unlike anything happening in professional studios in 2001. By the early 2000s, digital recording had transformed how albums were made. Producers used Pro Tools to stack dozens of tracks, samples layered on samples, every sound carefully sculpted and compressed. Drums were isolated from guitars. Vocals were recorded in pristine isolation booths. Click tracks kept everything perfectly in time. Raphael did the opposite of all of this. Everyone was pasting together 5 samples to make a snare drum sound, he explains. So what's the opposite of that? No samples. Everyone is playing to a click track and isolating drums from the guitar. So let's have everyone in the room at the same time, live. The Strokes set up in Transporter-Rom's small basement like they were playing a club show. Valenci and Hammond Jr. stood on opposite sides of the room with their Fender DeVille amps. Moretti's drum kit filled the center. Fracture's bass rumbled through everything. Casablanca sang live with the band whenever possible. Raphael used one Sennheiser 421 microphone in front of each guitar amp, running directly into API preamps with no EQ, simple, direct. For Casablanca's vocals, Raphael tried something unusual. He wanted the vocals to sound worn, intimate, like a favorite pair of jeans, as Casablancas described it. Sometimes Julian sang through a practice amp. Sometimes he held a handheld microphone instead of using a studio mic. The vocals were deliberately compressed, slightly distorted, pushed back in the mix so they blended with the instruments rather than dominating them. The technique was revolutionary, or more accurately, it was anti-revolutionary. It rejected everything modern production valued. "I don't like to use compressors and take away my textures," Raphael explained, "because I was raised on music that was recorded before technology advanced to the place where it could be smooth. I want to hear that thickness of sound. You can't get that from a computer." RCA sent an A&R representative to check on progress. He listened to the rough mixes and was horrified. "It sounds unprofessional," he told Raphael. "You're ruining Julian's voice and killing any chance the band has of a career." The label gave Ryan Gentles a list of big-name producers they wanted to replace Raphael with immediately. Raphael felt defeated. But then James Endicott from Rough Trade visited the studio. When he heard the playback, he threw his hat in the air with joy. "He gets it," Raphael thought. "I'm not crazy." Casablancas fought for Raphael. He played the A&R representative some tracks on a boombox, not through the studio monitors, but on a cheap portable player. Somehow that convinced the executive. The band and producer were given complete control. The songs came together quickly. Some tracks were recorded live in just a few takes. Others required multiple attempts as the band experimented with different approaches. Alone Together took 3 completely different productions before they found the right version. One was fully live, one isolated just the drums, one used programmed beats. Each time they'd build the entire song, then Casablancas would say, "No, I hate how this sounds." They'd start over. Raphael's job, as he saw it, was to make the band happy with their music, something he wished someone had done for him when he was a musician. The mixing process was equally unconventional. Raphael would often mix tracks live as the band played, trying to create a finished version by the end of each take. Doo-wop, That Thing, ended up with 128 tracks, 2 48-track machines plus 2 24-track machines all running simultaneously, an insane technical feat for such a seemingly simple song. The band would take rough mixes across the street to a bar called 2A where they worked, playing the songs loud on the stereo to hear how they sounded outside the studio context. By April 2001, they had an album. RCA listened and didn't know what to make of it. Too lo-fi, too raw, definitely not radio-friendly. But Rough Trade loved it. And the band knew they'd made something special. The album needed cover art. The Strokes were leaving soon for tours in Australia and Europe. The art department was panicking. They needed something immediately. Colin Lane was a New York photographer who'd done some fashion work. Rough Trade hired him to shoot press photos of the Strokes. Lane brought his portfolio to show the band what his style was like. In the portfolio was a Polaroid he'd shot 2 years earlier. His girlfriend at the time had just gotten out of the shower. Lane had noticed some black Chanel leather gloves that a stylist had left in his apartment after a different shoot. On impulse, he had his girlfriend put on one glove and shot 1 pack of Polaroid film, 10 pictures total. The image was simple: a woman's bare hip and bottom, a black-gloved hand resting suggestively on the skin. It was sexy without being explicit, stylish without being pretentious. Julian Casablancas saw it in the portfolio and immediately said, "That's cool. Would you mind if we used it for the cover?" Lane's girlfriend ended up getting paid about $1,000 from RCA for the image. The cover was perfect. It captured the Strokes' aesthetic: sexy, casual, slightly dangerous, effortlessly cool. It was also immediately controversial. When advance copies appeared in UK stores, retailers like HMV and Woolworths grumbled, but stocked them anyway. The album was in too much demand to refuse. But America was different. The US market was more conservative. Chain stores were more powerful. And there was another issue. The album was originally scheduled for release in the US on September 25, 2001. The band and label decided to create an alternate cover for America, a subatomic particle photograph, swirling patterns from a bubble chamber. Part of the image had actually appeared on Prince's Graffiti Bridge album years earlier. Casablancas later claimed he actually preferred the particle cover, telling Ryan Gentles, "I found something even cooler than the ass picture." But the original cover became iconic. Even today, when people think of "Is This It?", they think of Colin Lane's Polaroid. The band also made one more aesthetic choice. They deliberately left off the question mark from the album title. "It didn't look right aesthetically," they explained. "Is this it?" A statement, not a question. The album was released in Australia on July 30th, 2001, first in the world, timed to coincide with the Strokes tour supporting UMI. Japan got it on August 22nd, right after 2 shows at the Summer Sonic Festival. The UK release came on August 27th, perfectly timed with Reading and Leeds festivals. The UK response was immediate and overwhelming. The album hit number 2 on the charts with first-week sales of 48,293 copies. Critics fell over themselves with superlatives. NME's John Robinson gave it a perfect 10. There's nothing unnecessary here. Is This It? Is an album by a band that knows its strengths, knows its collective mind. Rolling Stone's Joe Levy called it the stuff of which legends are made, and described it as more joyful and intense than anything else I've heard this year. Robert Christgau in The Village Voice praised them as a great groove band with beats that implode, clashing, resolving with punky brevity. AllMusic's Heather Ferris noted, "The Strokes don't rehash the sounds that inspire them. They remake them in their own image." The Strokes were scheduled to play the CMJ Music Marathon in New York on September 17th. The US release was set for September 25th, 2001. Then, on the morning of September 11th, 2001, 2 planes hit the World Trade Center. The vinyl version of Is This It? Was released in America that day, September 11th, and shipped to stores with the original track list intact. But the CD release was postponed. One song on the album became immediately problematic, New York City Cops. The lyrics, based on Casablanca's frustration with police harassment of young people, included the line, "New York City Cops, they ain't too smart." In the wake of September 11th, when NYPD officers were dying in rescue attempts, when police and firefighters were being hailed as heroes, the song felt wrong. The band made a decision. They'd replace New York City Cops on the CD version with a newly recorded song called When It Started. The vinyl release, already pressed and shipped, kept the original tracklist. On October 9th, 2001, 2 weeks delayed, Is This It? Was finally released in America. The country was in mourning. The music industry was paralyzed, unsure how to operate in this new reality. Radio was playing patriotic songs and tributes to first responders. And into this moment came an album about being young, drunk, and cool in New York City. In retrospect, the timing was perfect. America needed Is This It? In October 2001. Not because it addressed September 11th, it didn't, couldn't, hadn't been made for that purpose, but because it reminded people what New York City was before the tragedy. The cool, the swagger, the casual confidence, the city that had given the world the Velvet Underground and the Ramones and Blondie. Is This It? Was a pre-9/11 snapshot of New York, frozen in audio, and that became part of its legend. The album entered the Billboard 200 at number 74, selling just 16,000 copies in its first week, modest by major label standards. But it kept selling. Week after week, it moved units. By January 2002, a performance on Saturday Night Live caused a 60% sales spike, pushing the album to peak at number 33. The singles performed better. Hard to Explain became an alternative rock staple. Last Night, widely acknowledged as being heavily influenced by Tom Petty's American Girl, hit the top 5 on the modern rock charts. Someday followed, another alternative rock hit. Critics who'd been lukewarm on guitar music suddenly remembered why they'd fallen in love with rock in the first place. But the bigger story was happening globally. Is This It? Became Album of the Year for virtually every major publication: Billboard, CMJ, Entertainment Weekly, NME, Play Louder, Time. In the Village Voice's Paz and Job Critics poll, aggregating 621 prominent reviewers, it came in second, just behind Bob Dylan's Love and Theft. In 2002, the Strokes won Best International Newcomer at the Brit Awards. NME named them Band of the Year and Best New Act. The album went platinum in the UK and US. Worldwide sales eventually topped 2 million copies. Massive for a debut indie rock album. But numbers don't tell the real story. The real story is what happened next. In 2001, guitar music was in trouble. Nu metal dominated American rock radio. Limp Bizkit, Linkin Park, Korn. It was aggressive, often misogynistic, artistically limited. In the UK, post-Britpop bloat had resulted in endless acoustic ballads and safe indie strumming. Is This It? Blew all of that away. Suddenly, leather jackets were cool again. Skinny jeans replaced baggy pants. Messy hair replaced backward baseball caps. Guitars replaced turntables at indie clubs. Within 18 months, a wave of garage rock revival bands emerged. The White Stripes broke through with White Blood Cells in 2001. Yeah, Yeah, Yes, Interpol and the Libertines followed. Franz Ferdinand, The Killers, Kings of Leon came next. But nobody was more influenced than a 15-year-old kid in Sheffield named Alex Turner. The arrival of the Strokes changed what music I was listening to, what shoes I was wearing, Turner later said. I grew my hair out and borrowed my mum's blazer. I was a huge fan. Turner formed Arctic Monkeys directly because of the Strokes. In 2018, he'd open his song Star Treatment with the confession, I just wanted to be one of the Strokes. I remember I used to play that first album in college all the time, Turner explained in 2011. When our band was first starting, loads of people were into them, so loads of bands coming out sounded like them. And I remember consciously trying not to sound like the Strokes, deliberately taking bits out of songs that sounded too much like them, but I still loved that album. The influence rippled outward. Without the Strokes, there's no Arctic Monkeys. Without Arctic Monkeys, the entire 2000s indie rock explosion looks different. The Kaiser Chiefs, the Kooks, the Vaccines, all walked through doors, the Strokes opened. Even bands that didn't sound like the Strokes were influenced by what they represented. That guitar music could be cool again, that you didn't need to be angry or ironic, that simple, direct songwriting could compete in the modern music landscape. James Murphy of LCD Sound System called Is This It his record of the decade? I guarantee you're going to have a barbecue in 10 years, play that shit and say, I love this record. Karen O of Yeah Yeah Yeahs remembered an early New York show. All right, this is the competition. Interpol's Daniel Kessler called the music unstoppable and infectious, and as such will be forever. By 2009, when critics compiled their decade-end lists, Is This It topped NME's 100 greatest albums of the decade. Rolling Stone ranked it number 2, behind only Radiohead's Kid A. Pitchfork placed it at number 7 in their top 200 albums of the 2000s. In 2020, Rolling Stone raised its ranking to number 114 on the all-time greatest albums list. The Library of Congress hasn't added it to the National Recording Registry yet, but give it time. Here's the part nobody talks about. The Strokes never quite figured out what to do after Is This It? Their second album, Room on Fire, 2003, was good, great even, but it sounded like Is This It Part 2. Critics accused them of playing it safe. The band recorded it quickly with Gord and Raphael again, delivering exactly what fans wanted. Sales were strong, but some of the magic was gone. The third album, First Impressions of Earth, 2006, tried to expand their sound. It topped the UK charts, went to number 4 in the US, but internally the band was fracturing. They initially worked with Raphael, then replaced him with producer David Kahne. The sessions were tense. The result was uneven. After that, the Strokes took a 5-year break. When they returned with Angles in 2011, they'd changed their creative process. Instead of Casablancas controlling everything, they worked democratically. The result was an album that pleased nobody. Not democratic enough to satisfy band members, not focused enough to satisfy fans. Come Down Machine, 2013, was barely promoted. RCA didn't push it. The band didn't tour extensively. It felt like they'd given up. It wasn't until The New Abnormal in 2020, nearly 2 decades after their debut, that the Strokes made another album that felt essential. It won the Grammy for Best Rock Album, their first Grammy ever. But by then, Ryan Gentles was no longer their manager. The band he'd helped build from nothing had moved on without him. What happened? How did 5 kids who saved rock and roll become a band that couldn't agree on anything? The answers are complicated. Egos, success, the pressure of following up perfection, Casablanca's increasing interest in solo projects, and the voids. The other members wanting more creative input. The impossibility of recapturing lightning in a bottle. Gord and Raphael offers a philosophical take. Sometimes when you have a really big blessing, you have a really big weight that comes along with that, and some people can get weak along the way. The highs were super, super high, and the lows were super, super low. The truth might be simpler. They made a perfect album on their first try. And you can't do that twice. 24 years later, Is This It still sounds like nothing else. Put it on in 2025 and it doesn't sound dated. The production is raw, but that rawness was intentional. The songs are short, only 2 tracks break 4 minutes. The whole album is just 36 minutes. By modern standards, it's practically an EP. But those 36 minutes changed everything. Is This It proved that simple could be sophisticated, that lo-fi could be intentional, That you didn't need to layer 50 tracks or hire expensive producers or spend months in the studio. You needed good songs, a clear vision, and the courage to trust your instincts. It proved that rock music wasn't dead in 2001. It just needed someone to remember what made it great in the first place. The album's influence extends beyond its immediate garage rock revival. You can hear it in the 1975's taut guitar interplay, in MGMT's Art School Cool, in Tame Impala's refusal to overproduce, in every indie band that's prioritized vibe over technical perfection. Colin Lane's controversial cover photograph became one of the most iconic album covers of the 21st century, right up there with Nirvana's Nevermind Baby or Pink Floyd's Prism. It's been endlessly parodied, referenced, and homaged. Individual songs have taken on lives of their own. Last Night became the template for countless indie rock anthems. Someday is still played at every Strokes show, crowds singing every word. Hard to Explain influenced a generation of songwriters to embrace ambiguity in their lyrics. The album's biggest trick was making carefulness look careless. Everything about Is This It feels effortless, the performances, the production, the image. But that effortlessness required enormous effort. Casablanca spent years crafting these songs before the band recorded them. Raphael experimented endlessly to get the sounds right. The band played these tracks hundreds of times in tiny clubs before entering the studio. They just made it look easy. The question that was never asked on the album cover has haunted the Strokes ever since. Is this it? Is this all there is? Did we peak at 23? For some bands, one perfect album is enough. The Velvet Underground never topped their debut. The Stone Roses never matched their first record. Some lightning can only be captured once. The Strokes have continued making music, touring, evolving. Julian Casablancas formed The Voids and released challenging, experimental records that bear little resemblance to the Strokes. The other members have pursued solo projects. They reunite, fight, separate, reunite again. But Is This It remains frozen in time, a perfect snapshot of 5 kids in a basement making the album they wanted to hear. 24 years later, Alex Turner is still playing Strokes covers at Arctic Monkeys shows. Kids who weren't born in 2001 are discovering Is This It and having the same revelation their parents did. Fashion designers still reference the band's aesthetic. Leather jackets, skinny jeans, Converse sneakers, messy hair. The album topped NME's Albums of the Decade list in 2009. It appears on every greatest albums list worth reading. Apple Music ranked it number 68 in their 100 best albums in 2024. Rolling Stone called it one of the 250 greatest albums of the 21st century. Not bad for an album recorded in 6 weeks in a basement that was being foreclosed. Gordon Raphael, still producing bands around the world, has a measured perspective on his greatest achievement. The Strokes, gave the world something. And if that's all there is, maybe it was enough. The Strokes never quite saved rock and roll. Rock and roll doesn't need saving. It just needs someone to remember what made it great. Is This It? Was that reminder. 5 kids, 1 basement, 36 minutes, 0 apologies. They made rock cool again. Then they walked away. And maybe that's the most rock and roll thing they could have done. This has been the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. Some stories, like The Strokes, are about capturing a perfect moment and never trying to repeat it.